So I recently made a video about the Bakkerschutplan, this insane plan come up with by the Dutch government following the Second World War to annex a large part of Western Germany into the Netherlands. Thankfully, the Allies said absolutely not, and the plan didn't go ahead, albeit the Dutch did take over some 70 square kilometers of German terrain, which they would promptly give back within a decade. But in today's video, what if it had actually happened? And what if the Netherlands had taken over this huge swath of German territory today and added it into the Netherlands? So just to go over what we're talking about here, the subject of this other video, the Bakkerschutplan was come up with by the Rijksdienst voor het Nationale Plan and envisaged taking over a large part of West German territory in order to pay reparations to the Netherlands for what Germany had done in the Second World War. This included a large belt of land going across the Netherlands' eastern border. There were several variations of this plan, each being slightly less ambitious in scope. But to make this video the most interesting, let's go with the absolutely craziest plan there was, variation A, that just included absolutely everything into it that we see on this map here. So how would history have been different if this had actually gone ahead? Well, it's important to look at the terrain that was being demanded by the Netherlands. There were three key cities in this area: Aachen, Köln, and Münster. Now, there was also part of the industrial region of the Ruhr, which was much sought after German terrain and had actually been occupied after the First World War by France and Belgium. So this would greatly have increased not only the average height of the Netherlands, finally adding some more mountainous terrain into this famously flat land, but also their own industrial output. Now, one thing that would very soon have changed is the names of the cities involved, as of course they all had German place names. And this was quite in some detail planned out by the Planning Commission. So a city like Mönchengladbach would become the Dutch Monniken-Glabbeek. In fact, I like this so much that I went through and looked at these proposed Dutch names that I could find for some German towns. Some are quite established, so Aachen, for instance, is just commonly known as Aachen in Dutch, or for example, Cologne is just Köln in Dutch. But some they actively came up with by looking at the Low German names, the local names in Low German for these places, and then coming up with their own versions. So places like Burg Steinfurt would become Steenvoorde, Geilenkirchen would become Geelkerken, while Jemgum would become Jemmingen, and Kleve would be Kleef. Many of these are simply direct translations of the German, although some are rather more interesting, like Nijenhuis, which looks a little bit more like it would be a Frisian version or a variant of Neuenhaus, literally new house. Osnabrück has become Osnabrügge, that Brug word being the word for bridge, the same as Brück in German. We know that the Dutch were actually vaguely serious about making these name changes because one of these towns, Tudern, was actually one of the areas taken by the Dutch, part of that 70 kilometer squared that they actually did annex, and they did then change the name to Tuderen rather than keeping it as Tudern. And in 1960, when the Germans got it back from the Netherlands, they changed the names back. I had a look online to see what I could find about the Bakkerschutplan and if anyone else had thought about an alternate history, and I found a really nice map made by Tranks Mark on Imaginary Maps on Reddit, which is this one, thinking about the Netherlands if they had gone on and followed the Bakkerschutplan. And as you can see from this map, they've come up with a few interesting ideas. So several Dutch provinces seem to have remained largely the same, with the exception of Flevoland, which has gone on to make even more polders than there are today. Some Dutch provinces have simply been expanded, so the Dutch border provinces of Groningen, Drenthe, Overijssel and Gelderland, which today border Germany, have been expanded to incorporate large parts of that German border area, while several new Dutch provinces have also been created. So those that Tranks Mark has suggested were Neder-Rijn, Münster, Sachsen, Oost-Friesland and Oldenburg. which are all Dutchified versions of current German place names, for instance, Münster, Sachsen, Ostfriesland, and Oldenburg. The area being claimed by the Netherlands in the largest version of the Bacchus-Schut-Plan would encompass somewhere around 13 million people who live there today. Now, if we add that with the population of the Netherlands, which is some 18 million, that would bring the Dutch population up to 31 million in total. Although, of course, there is a big question about what would happen to those Germans in the land that would become Dutch, as part of the Bacchus-Schut-Plan was certainly mass deportations of the Germans that were already living there. Now, of course, this was quite hard to swallow, not only for many people in the Dutch government, ultimately causing a lot of opposition to the plan, but likely also in various international organizations. This ultimately, though, is what happened to Germans in Eastern Europe following the Second World War, who were deported en masse. And in the Netherlands, there was some clamour for this also to occur should the Bacchus-Schut-Plan be implemented. The slogan Oostland ons land, or Eastland our land, was quite popular at the time. And as you can see from this poster, which is recommending annexation, the bottom part there says Duits grondgebied zonder Duitsers. German territory without Germans, which really is rather sinister. You can actually also see that they've put the Dutch place names of Köln and Aachen in there instead of the German place names. The way that they would do this would be staggered, so any towns that were of a larger population than 2,500 would be the first to go. Anyone that had been a member of the NSDAP, or the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, basically the Nazi party, or any related party, would immediately be deported, and anyone that had arrived in the area after 1933 could also start packing their bags. There was some limited scope for German citizens to become Dutch if they so chose. One of these ways in which people would be allowed to be Dutchified was if they spoke either Low German, Limburgish, or the Kleef dialect as their first language, as they were then seen as being a minority and not so closely tied in with the German nationality instead. But obviously still a lot of people would be sent away, so the big question is, who would have moved into these areas? Well, one possible answer is that at the end of the Second World War in 1945, the Netherlands became involved in another war in Indonesia, or as it was then, the Dutch East Indies. While many Indonesians would fight against the Dutch, many of them to create a separate Indonesian state, many also fought to either remain within the Netherlands as the Dutch East Indies, or to create their own state independent of a larger Indonesian state. In 1949, this was granted as the Netherlands East Indies gave way to the Federation of Indonesia. This would only last a year, and then Indonesia became a centralized state rather than a federation. However, quite a few people were unhappy with this course of events, some of those being those of the Republic of South Moluccas, a region in Indonesia which had been very loyal to the Dutch and whose soldiers had fought on the same side as the Dutch during the colonial wars. The Netherlands stepped in and said that its soldiers could be brought over to the Netherlands while a different solution was found, and so many Moluccans who had served in the KNIL, or the Dutch East Indies forces, were relocated to the Netherlands. However, no political solution was found, as the state of Indonesia did not wish to relinquish control over the Moluccas. And so in the 1970s, many of the children of this generation of former KNIL soldiers started to carry out various acts of protest, including hostage-taking, most famously on trains and in schools, involving shootouts with Dutch military and Dutch police. Is it possible that in this timeline, if the Netherlands annexed such a large part of Germany and needed people to people it, although ultimately many of the Moluccans wanted political intervention in Indonesia rather than being resettled in the Netherlands, many of them did come and made a home, and their descendants still live in the Netherlands to this day. Indeed, anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 people from the Dutch East Indies came over to the Netherlands, many of them being of European or mixed descent, as they were removed from Indonesia in 1957, being declared enemies of the state by Sukarno. In 1962, when Dutch New Guinea was attacked by Indonesia and then forced to be given to the Indonesians, many more refugees came at that point. So it's possible that those coming to the Netherlands then might have gone to the new Eastern Netherlands, as it would have been if this plan was carried out at the time. Some other possibilities are that other people from the Dutch diaspora throughout the world, as a result of its colonial endeavours, would have returned to the Netherlands at this time to move into these new areas. One might think of Dutch people in Suriname and the rest of the Caribbean, parts of India or Sri Lanka, or perhaps even some colonies whose ties were a little further afield, such as those living in South Africa speaking the Afrikaans language, for instance. Emigration has been a very key part of Dutch history, certainly following the Second World War, during this period of economic downturn in the late 40s and 50s, moving principally to the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, as well as various other countries. Many of the reasons given for why they were leaving was that the Netherlands was particularly crowded and it was very difficult to have space, particularly to become a farmer or to work in industry. In fact, the Dutch diaspora is around 33 million estimated to be to this day. It's possible that if new land was made available, and let's say that the Germans were forcibly removed from their homes, that people would instead have gone and found farmland there rather than so far afield. So that's looking a bit at how that would have affected the Netherlands, but how would it have affected Germany in the same time? Well, it's likely that it would have been a very negative effect, of course, on the Germans who would be removed from their homes, if that did indeed happen, but also for the rest of West Germany, which was, of course, in ruins at the end of the Second World War and was forced to look after millions of Germans who had been removed from their homes throughout Eastern Europe. This, of course, is one of the main reasons why the Allies did not agree to Dutch plans, as well as them being, frankly, ridiculous to take so much of Germany into the Netherlands, because there were simply too many refugees and they needed Germany as a strong buffer. Of course, quite a lot does depend on whether or not these deportations would actually take place. And a good indicator is that from those 70 kilometers squared of German territory the Netherlands did take, they hardly deported anyone. So perhaps it's unlikely that had the Bakkerschut plan gone ahead, the Netherlands would have deported so many people anyway. No doubt, though, this would have engendered particularly bad feeling between the Netherlands and Germany if such a considerable part of Germany were to become Dutch. If that were the case, it seems that the Netherlands would be required to do more in terms of the Cold War balance of power, as West Germany would be weakened, losing millions of its population and part of the industrial Ruhr. Perhaps the Netherlands then would have to become a more powerful military force in order to ward off the Soviets, but let's just hope that that wouldn't be required. If the Netherlands didn't deport so many people from the new German territories, it's possible that some kind of movement would have risen up, some kind of civil demonstration, or perhaps an armed military group in order to pressure the government to return these lands to German control. Indeed, Dutch annexation was not particularly popular in those areas that were taken into the Netherlands. Whatever the people within the occupied zone would do, it seems very certain that the West German government would have protested this very strongly and would have negotiated to have all of its territory returned if possible. They did this in 1957 with those annexed areas of the Netherlands, indeed getting pretty much all of it back, bar one hill, by 1960. It's a different story with Germany's eastern borders following World War II, where in 1972 they agreed to Soviet demands to recognize the eastern borders of Germany and lose a lot of its former territory. This was reaffirmed in 1990 when a unified Germany came about, that they would not press to have those lands returned that had been given to Poland. Of course, this was being backed by the military might of the Soviet Union. It seems unlikely the Netherlands would have been able to back up similar threats against the German government, that they have to accept the new borders that were being drawn there. Of course, in the eastern situation, all the Germans were sent packing, and so there was no one left. It seems somewhat unlikely this would be the same case with the Bakkerschut plan, and so any idea of a German government pushing for those eastern territories to be returned to Germany would be frankly ridiculous because of the extent of Polonization that has occurred there. Perhaps the most important consideration between the Netherlands and Germany is football, as in 1974 the Football World Cup final between the Germans and the Netherlands was shockingly and through treacherous means won by the Germans. However, if the Buckerschut plan had gone along, then 3 of the key players that were on the pitch that day, Forts, Bonhoff and Overath, would have been playing for the Netherlands, as their homes would no longer be in Germany, but would instead be in the Netherlands. And I think with that, they would have made the difference, and the Netherlands would have won the 1974 World Cup. Alright everyone, let me know in the comments below, what do you think about what would have happened if the Buckerschut plan was realised to its full extent? I'd be curious to see, do you think that the world would look very different? I think that had this insane plan actually gone ahead, then most likely, as what happened with the around 70 square kilometres of German territory the Dutch government did annex in the end, it would be given back pretty quickly. It was a ridiculous plan. And I think that it's probably a good thing that it didn't end up happening in the end, but feel free to disagree for whatever reason in the comments below. A few people mentioned on the original video that I may have overstated the case for the lack of connection between the Netherlands and that part of Germany. There are some areas across the border in Germany where Dutch is spoken, and the dialects there of Low German are fairly similar to or really closely related actually to the dialects of Low German or Neder-Saxisch dialects of that language, I should add. They're not dialects of Dutch or German, they are their own language variety. And so that is rather interesting. But anyway, let me know in the comments below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I have been Hilbert, and this has been The Alternate History.